The Power Broker, published in 1974, is Robert Caro's monumental biography of Robert Moses, the unelected official who reshaped New York City and state for over 4 decades. At more than 1,300 pages, the book won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography and is widely considered one of the greatest works of American nonfiction ever written. It is not merely a biography. It is a deep study of how power actually works in a democracy and how a single man could bypass elections, courts, and public opinion to build an empire of concrete and steel. Caro spent 7 years researching and writing the book, interviewing over 500 people, including Moses himself. The book's central question is one Caro would spend his career answering. How does power work, and what does it do to the people who hold it? Part 1. The Idealist. Early Life and Education. Robert Moses was born in 1888 to a wealthy German Jewish family in New Haven, Connecticut. His mother, Bella, was a formidable, strong-willed woman deeply involved in social reform, and her influence on young Robert was profound. He was raised in comfort, attended Yale, then Oxford, where he developed a love for British institutions and the idea of a non-partisan civil service. A class of educated men who could govern rationally above the grubby compromises of machine politics. This idealism defined his early career. Moses returned to New York determined to reform the corrupt patronage system of city government. He designed an ambitious civil service reform plan meant to replace political hacks with trained experts. It was intellectually brilliant, and it failed completely. Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that controlled New York City, crushed it without difficulty. Moses learned a hard lesson. Good ideas mean nothing without power to enact them. The turn. This failure changed Moses. Caro portrays this as the pivotal transformation of his life. The idealistic young reformer began to understand that in America's political system, being right was not enough. You needed leverage, money, law, and the ability to reward friends and destroy enemies. Moses set out to acquire all three, and in doing so began to lose the very idealism that had first driven him. He found his opening through Bell Moskowitz, a close advisor to New York Governor Al Smith. Moses attached himself to Smith, made himself indispensable through his encyclopedic grasp of law and government structure, and became the governor's chief instrument for building public works, starting with the state park system on Long Island. Part 2. The Creation of Power. Bills that buried power in the fine print. Moses's genius, Caro argues, was legislative. While other men saw laws as means to public ends, Moses saw them as tools for building permanent, unaccountable power. He drafted the legislation that created New York's public authorities, entities like the Triborough Bridge Authority, and buried within the dense legal language provisions that gave him extraordinary independence. Public authorities could issue bonds, collect tolls, and use that revenue independent of the ordinary budget process. Crucially, Moses wrote the bond contracts so that the revenue from tolls could not be used to pay off the bonds early or be diverted elsewhere, meaning the tolls and the authority would never end and could never be shut down by a mayor, a governor, or the legislature. He effectively made himself permanent and immune from electoral accountability, all while remaining an appointed, not elected, official. Jones Beach and the Long Island Park System. Moses's first great achievement was the creation of Jones Beach and the broader Long Island State Park System in the 1920s. Caro describes this period admiringly. Moses walked the marshes and dunes himself, envisioned a public beach of extraordinary beauty, accessible to millions of New Yorkers, and drove the project forward with ferocious energy, working impossible hours and mastering every engineering detail personally. But even here, the darker patterns emerged. To build the parkways leading to Jones Beach, Moses needed land from wealthy Long Island estate owners who did not want a highway, or the public, anywhere near them. Moses used his growing legal and political power to simply take the land through condemnation, fighting drawn-out legal battles and using the levers of state power to crush opposition from some of the richest and most influential families in America. He won, and the victory taught him that no one, however powerful, could stop him if he was determined and knew the law better than they did. Overpasses as social engineering. One of the book's most famous and controversial claims involves the parkway overpasses Moses built on Long Island. Caro reports that Moses had these overpasses built intentionally low, too low for buses to pass beneath. Since poorer New Yorkers and black New Yorkers were far more likely to rely on public buses than private automobiles, This design choice effectively restricted access to Jones Beach and other parks for those populations while preserving them for the car-owning white middle and upper classes. This account has since been debated by some historians, but in the book it stands as a powerful symbol of how physical infrastructure could be used as an instrument of exclusion, deniable and permanent, embedded in concrete rather than law. Part 3. The Instruments of Power. The Triborough Bridge Authority. The construction of the Triborough Bridge in the 1930s marked Moses's transformation into the most powerful man in New York, more powerful than any mayor or governor. The Triborough Bridge Authority generated enormous toll revenue, and Moses controlled it absolutely. He used this financial empire to fund an ever-expanding portfolio of projects, and he used the jobs, contracts, and favors it generated to build a network of loyal supporters. Bankers, contractors, engineers, union leaders, and newspaper editors, all of whom depended on Moses's goodwill for their livelihoods. Caro describes in detail how Moses cultivated the press, feeding friendly reporters exclusive stories and access while freezing out critics. He orchestrated relentless public relations campaigns that painted him as a selfless public servant, above politics, uninterested in personal gain, an image that endured for decades even as the reality grew far more complicated. Moses and the governors and mayors. A recurring structure in the book is Moses's relationship with the elected officials nominally above him. Caro details his dealings with governors Al Smith, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Herbert Lehman, Thomas Dewey, Averell Harriman, and Nelson Rockefeller, and with New York City mayors from Jimmy Walker through John Lindsay. Roosevelt in particular despised Moses and tried repeatedly to strip him of power once Roosevelt became president. But Moses's control of state law and public authority structures made him nearly impossible to remove. The chapters on Moses and FDR reveal Caro's larger theme. Even the most powerful elected officials in America could be stymied by an appointed bureaucrat who had built his own independent base of financial and legal power. With mayors, the pattern often repeated. A new mayor would come into office intending to rein Moses in, only to discover that Moses controlled the funding, the expertise, and the public works projects the city desperately needed. Most mayors ultimately capitulated and worked with him rather than against him. Part 4. The Highways and the City. The Automobile Age. From the 1930s through the 1960s, Moses built an almost unimaginable quantity of infrastructure. The Triborough, Verrazano Narrows, and Throggs Neck bridges, the Long Island Expressway, Cross Bronx Expressway, and dozens of other highways and parkways. Lincoln Center, the 1964 World's Fair, and hundreds of parks and playgrounds. He held up to 12 official titles simultaneously across city and state government, an unprecedented concentration of administrative authority. Caro credits Moses with real achievements. Public parks and beaches that transformed the quality of life for millions of New Yorkers, and infrastructure that enabled the region's growth. But the book's central argument is that Moses's methods and his growing contempt for the ordinary people he displaced caused enormous and often irreversible harm. The Cross Bronx Expressway and the displacement of communities. The most devastating sections of the book concern the human cost of Moses's highway building. The Cross Bronx Expressway, built through the working-class neighborhood of East Tremont, required the demolition of thriving apartment buildings and the displacement of thousands of families, most of whom had nowhere comparable to go. Caro documents in granular, heartbreaking detail how Moses refused to consider an alternate route just a few blocks away that would have spared the neighborhood and displaced far fewer people, reportedly because rerouting would have required more paperwork and delay. In total, Caro estimates Moses's projects displaced roughly 250,000 people over his career, overwhelmingly the poor, working class, and communities of color who had no political power to resist him. Neighborhoods were destroyed, communities were scattered into inadequate public housing, and Moses showed little interest in the human consequences of his engineering decisions. Caro portrays this indifference as central to Moses's character in his later years. A man so convinced of the rightness of his vision and so insulated by decades of unchecked power that ordinary people had become mere obstacles on a map. Neglect of mass transit. Another major theme is Moses's almost ideological preference for highways over public transportation. Despite mounting evidence that New York needed to invest in subways and mass transit, Moses funneled enormous resources into roads and bridges for automobiles, a bias Caro argues contributed directly to the region's chronic traffic congestion and the long-term decline of its transit system, consequences the city continued to grapple with for decades afterward. Part 5. The Fall. Robert Kennedy and the Battle for Contro. Moses had survived 4 decades of trying to be pushed out by elected officials, but Caro's final chapters detail his eventual downfall. In the 1960s, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who needed Moses's public authority's bonding power for his own purposes, outmaneuvered him, and Robert F. Kennedy's investigations into the 1964 World's Fair, which Moses ran and which lost enormous sums of money, exposed financial mismanagement that damaged his once untouchable reputation. Ultimately, Rockefeller forced Moses into a face-saving merger that folded Moses's authorities into a new state entity, stripping him of his independent financial base. The man who had never been elected to anything, and who had outlasted governors and presidents, was finally undone not by voters but by a rival power player who understood the same authority-based tactics Moses himself had pioneered. Death and legacy. Moses died in 1981 at age 92, largely out of power for over a decade, his reputation already in serious decline, thanks in part to Caro's book, published 7 years earlier. Caro's closing assessment is unsparing. Moses built extraordinary things, but he built them by amassing power that no democratic system had intended anyone to hold, and he used that power increasingly to serve his own vision and ego rather than the public he claimed to serve. Major themes. Power reveals character. Caro's most famous thesis, developed across this book and his later LBJ biographies, is that power doesn't corrupt so much as it reveals who someone already was. Moses's early idealism gave way to authoritarian methods once he discovered how much he could get away with. Unelected power is often more durable than elected power. Through public authorities, bond contracts, and legal complexity, Moses built a position more secure than any mayors or governors, illustrating how technical and legal structures can concentrate power outside democratic accountability. Infrastructure is never neutral. Roads, bridges, and overpasses encode political choices about who benefits and who is displaced, decisions that can outlast the individuals who made them by generations. The cost of progress. Caro forces readers to weigh Moses's genuine achievements, parks, beaches, bridges used by millions, against the destroyed neighborhoods and displaced families that made them possible, refusing an easy verdict either way. Why the book endures. The Power Broker remains essential reading, not just for New Yorkers, but for anyone interested in how power actually functions in modern government, often through unglamorous instruments like bond indentures, zoning law, and appointed authorities rather than elections and speeches. It has influenced generations of journalists, urban planners, and politicians. President Obama has cited it as a favorite book, and it stands as a masterclass in narrative nonfiction, meticulously reported, morally serious, and gripping as a novel despite its enormous length. Caro's central warning is as relevant today as it was in 1974. Democratic societies must remain vigilant about how power accumulates in unelected hands, because once entrenched, it can prove almost impossible to